Right now, Newzroom Afrika's Ahmed Kajee is live for us from Adana in Turkey. Good evening, Ahmed. Good to have you, and thank you very much for your time tonight. More rescuers arriving. Russia sending a number of rescuers there, and I believe the Ukraine as well will be sending some rescuers on the ground in Turkey.
Very much so. Thanks very much, Thabo. This just goes to show that the answer, the call for relief efforts, rescuers, is being answered by countries and organizations across the globe. Yesterday, Ukraine had announced that they will be sending 87 rescuers to Turkey to carry out their operations in the different parts of the country. And then coming in this evening, just behind me, a Russian delegation. They have come through and will be deployed to their respective areas. Just to take you through that particular process, the Joint Operating Center is taking place over here at this particular airport. And from here, the ADAF, they are the organization specifically dedicated to emergency response teams in and around Turkey, and they are now designating all relief organizations to different parts of the country and different parts of the region to ensure that the adequate response is taken through to the respective areas as well. The Gift of the Givers team, we will be making our way through to an area around 300 kilometers away. I'll be giving you that name in a few moments, just once we get a confirmation from the Gift of the Givers team as well. But Thabo, let me just take you back over the last 24 hours in terms of what has taken place from the Gift of the Givers team. We had left Tambo International at 8 p.m. South African time last night. They say that this is the quickest we've actually seen us reach the point where we would just be a few hours away from operations actually starting. We had landed in Istanbul to a bitingly cold morning as well. It was around between -2 degrees Celsius and 1 degree Celsius with snowfall throughout, and that was, as we just left the airport terminal building, it just goes to show the coldness that we experienced. One can only begin to imagine what it must be like for the victims and the victims' families of those in those earthquake-stricken areas. It must be exceptionally difficult for them as well. But Thabo, as I continue with that conversation, I'm just going to ask my colleague Maxwell Solotola to just take you through what we are seeing in this particular building over here. We are waiting with the Russian emergency services. They will be making their way to different parts of Russia, as I mentioned. Just speaking to the Gift of the Givers as well, we'll be going about 300 kilometers, which is about a 3-hour drive, to the Hatay region alongside some of the Turkish officials and some of the Russian officials as well. So there is a multitude of organizations which will be carrying out their operations in and around this particular area. Just earlier on, we had seen officials coming through from the People's Republic of China. They've sent through quite a large delegation of rescue officials. That just goes to show the importance of different countries coming together, I think, across political regimes, across political ideologies. This is just something which is exceptionally important to see, given the fact that Russia and Ukraine may be having political issues away from this particular disaster. It seems that they are still sending teams to send out to this particular disaster, and this just goes to show the magnitude of this particular disaster, one of the biggest in the last 100 years. Those two earthquakes, 7.7 and 7.6, inside 12 hours of each other, was absolutely devastating. The epicenter of the earthquake was around 11 miles, which is about 16 or 17 kilometers or so below the surface. So despite that being rather shallow, because it was at such close proximity to areas which is highly populated, this has resulted in the death toll from initially hearing on Monday morning at just a meager 600, unfortunately saying the word meager very lightly, all the way up to 11,000 between Syria and Turkey, which we're expecting to increase. That's the main reason for the high number of casualties. And also taking into consideration that this is the first earthquake actually struck at 4:17 a.m. at 4:15. Now, this being a predominantly Muslim country, people would normally have been awake for the morning prayers if this was the summer months. Because sunrise is a bit later in the day, people would have still been sleeping around that 4 o'clock, between 4 and 5 a.m. time. And that's exactly what we then had seen coming through with those high number of casualties, many people sleeping, and the fact that this also took place in the early morning with the epicenter being relatively close to the surface. surface. Just to add on to that, because this was in the southern parts of Turkey, close to the Syrian border, that particular area does not have the strongest level of infrastructure. So many of those buildings which would have been built do not have the strongest structural integrity, and that's one of the main reasons we are seeing, and that's high levels of casualties, high levels of people being injured, and people being rescued as well. And this is obviously going to affect thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people being displaced in and around that particular area. To maybe just to put this into perspective, probably the size of Germany over in this particular area has actually been affected in some way or form by this earthquake, by those earthquakes, or rather between the Syrian and Turkish border as well. Unfortunately, one of the big topics coming out of this particular disaster is that due to certain sanctions coming through from the United States and perhaps the Western Bloc in general, aid going through to Syria hasn't been as effective as it has been coming into Turkey. That is something that may be discussed later on coming through at the United Nations meetings, to ensure that at least in some way or form they get perhaps the appropriate response that has been coming through to Turkey in some way or form as well. But just speaking to what is taking place over here at the Adana airport, we are expected to be leaving for a destination, the Hayat region. That's about 300 kilometers away from where we are currently. But in regards to that, we are going to be delayed in terms of just getting all the logistics, getting transport, obviously all the emergency supplies which you had seen just a few moments ago. That all needs to be loaded up and then taken through to their respective organizations. And perhaps finally, a final point needs to also be mentioned to the rescue workers who have been doing this amazing work, taking time off from their daily jobs to carry out this rescue efforts. They would have probably been up from around 6 a.m. on Tuesday, if not before then. And in this instance, then it's been a case of flying out at 8 p.m. on Tuesday evening. And with us being still traveling 24 hours later, it seems that the only real time any operations would probably take place is in about another 12 hours time. So just thinking about the shifts that these guys have been putting in when it comes to actually burning the midnight candle, trying to work out as much as they possibly can, getting things out, getting all of the equipment settled down. And in many ways, they will actually be continuing the operations, perhaps sometimes in some way or form a bit more basic right now, considering what's meant to be taking place over the next 7 to 10 days. Sabo.
Ahmed Kajee, let me thank you tonight in Adana there in Turkey, bringing us that update. Of course, he's on the ground and he will be bringing us pictures and live coverage as they race against time to be able to retrieve some of those bodies that are caught still under the rubble following those two quakes that took place on Monday.